Welcome back to the Wild West Vault. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe and like this video. It helps more folks discover these stories. And drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. The year was 1883, a time when the world seemed stretched wide and wild, where the prairies rolled on like an endless sea and the wind carried stories older than the town springing up on their edges. In a valley tucked between low hills and tall grass, there lived a woman named Miriam. She was 45 years in age, and though her hair held streaks of silver and her hands bore the marks of long labor, her eyes still shone with quiet strength. Folks in town often whispered about her, too old to wed, they said, as though life had closed its doors upon her. Yet Miriam walked steady, with the grace of one who knew her worth was not in their words but in the one who gave her breath. Her little cabin sat at the edge of the settlement, where fields stretched out like a patchwork quilt. She kept a garden, tended chickens, and carried her own water from the well. Sundays found her in the small, clapboard church, head bowed in prayer, her voice lifting in hymns though never loud. She was not a woman who sought attention, but her presence was felt as steady as the ticking of a clock in a quiet room. Still, there were nights when the loneliness pressed hard. The world had not been kind to Miriam in her younger years. Suitors had passed her by. Seasons had slipped through her fingers, and though she bore it with courage, her heart sometimes ached for companionship. In the silence of her cabin, she would whisper prayers to the Lord, asking not for riches or glory, but only for the comfort of knowing she was not forgotten. It was in that same valley that a cowboy named Samuel rode his herd. He was a man of the open range, broad-shouldered and weathered by sun and storm, with a quiet strength that came from years of toil. Samuel had seen much of life, good harvests and bad, friends buried too soon, and the endless work of cattle and land. Yet for all his labor, his cabin stood empty, and his heart, though strong, carried its own solitude. Their paths crossed, not in some grand design, but in the simple way of country living. A broken wagon wheel near Miriam's field, a kind word offered, a loaf of bread shared in return. It was small at first, almost unnoticed, yet the Lord was writing something larger on the canvas of their lives. The summer sun bore down fierce upon the valley, turning the earth hard beneath the hooves of cattle and the boots of men. Samuel worked his herd with a steady hand, yet his mind often wandered toward the little cabin where Miriam lived. There was something about her that drew him, not beauty in the way the world spoke of it, but beauty born of resilience, faith, and kindness. The townsfolk noticed Samuel's visits, though they tried to mask their curiosity with polite nods. More than once, Miriam found a neighbor's glance lingering upon her, as if measuring the worth of her years against the rugged figure of the cowboy who tipped his hat at her gate. But Miriam carried on, her dignity unshaken, for she had learned long ago that the world's judgments were as fleeting as the prairie wind. Samuel began to see in Miriam what he had long sought without knowing. He watched her tend her garden, patient with each sprout. He heard her speak gently to children in the churchyard, her words steady and kind. And he noticed how she carried herself, not with pride, but with quiet assurance that her life was held in the hands of the Almighty. One evening, as the sun sank low and the valley turned to gold, Samuel paused by Miriam's fence. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low but firm, "this land has known many seasons, and so have I. But I reckon I've not seen a spirit as strong as yours." Miriam lowered her gaze and used to such words, but her heart stirred with something she thought long buried. And so began a slow courtship, not with grand gestures or loud declarations, but with shared moments. The mending of a fence, the reading of scripture by lamplight, the quiet of prayer beneath the wide night sky. Each day wove a new thread between them, threads that no whisper of the town could unravel. Yet no story worth telling moves without trial, and their path was not free of shadows. Whispers in town grew sharper. "She's too old," some said. "A cowboy like him could find a younger bride." Others shook their heads, as though Miriam's years were chains too heavy for love to carry. But Samuel paid them no mind. He saw not the count of her years, but the depth of her soul. And Miriam, though wounded by their words, leaned harder on her faith, trusting that the Lord had not brought Samuel into her life by accident. One Sunday, as the preacher read from the Psalms, Samuel sat beside Miriam in the pew. It was a simple act, yet it sent a ripple through the congregation. Some frowned, others smiled, but Miriam felt her heart lift. For in that moment, she knew she was no longer walking alone. The seasons turned, and with them came trials that tested their bond. A sickness swept through the valley, laying low many families. Miriam, though weary herself, moved from home to home with herbs and broth, tending the sick with gentle hands. Samuel rode long miles to bring supplies, his strength a comfort to many. Together, they became pillars for the community, not through wealth or power, but through service and faith. It was during those days that Samuel's heart grew certain. One evening, after a long day's ride, he stood at Miriam's gate and said, "The world may call you old, but I see a woman strong enough to hold up half the sky. If the Lord allows, I'd walk beside you till my last breath." Tears filled Miriam's eyes, not of sorrow, but of joy long delayed. For she knew then that the whispers of men were but dust compared to the promises of God. As spring returned, so did new life in the valley. Calves were born, fields blossomed, and hope seemed to rise with the green shoots of the earth. Samuel and Miriam found themselves working side by side more often, their days filled with the simple joys of labor shared. The townsfolk, once doubtful, began to see what love rooted in faith could build. Young women looked at Miriam with new respect, realizing that worth was not measured in youth alone. Men tipped their hats to Samuel, recognizing the strength it took to follow his heart rather than the crowd. Still, not all hearts softened. Amos Harlan, a rival cattleman, nursed envy in the shadows. His words, sharp as barbed wire, sought to cut Samuel down. Yet Samuel held his peace, for he knew the truth would outlast the lies. And Miriam, though aware of the venom, kept her eyes fixed on higher things, refusing to let bitterness take root. The bond between them grew as steady as the river that carved its way through the valley. One evening, beneath the cottonwood trees by the creek, Samuel spoke the words that had long burned in his heart. "Miriam, I thought my life was to be lived alone. But when I look at you, I see home. I see the Lord's kindness written plain. If you'll have me, I'll spend my days proving that no age, no whisper, no man's opinion can stand against God's plan." Miriam's voice trembled as she answered, "I never thought such grace would reach me. But if this is the path he's written, then I will walk it with you." And so their hands met, a simple joining, yet heavy with promise. No crowd, no music, no preacher, just two souls beneath the wide prairie sky, bound by faith and love. Winter came again, laying its quiet over the land, but Miriam and Samuel's home glowed warm. Their lives were not free of hardship, yet they stood together through each storm, drawing strength from the Lord and from one another. The town, once doubtful, now spoke of them with admiration. Their story spread beyond the valley, carried by those who had seen firsthand that hope does not fade with age, and that love can come in its own season, right on time. Even Amos Harlan, once bitter, learned that envy is a barren field while mercy reaps a harvest. Years later, as silver crowned their heads, they still walked hand in hand by the creek, a picture of faith, resilience, and love that no whisper could undo. So take this story to heart. Do not let the world tell you your time has passed, or that your worth is measured by age. For the Lord, who shapes the stars and commands the wind, writes each story in his perfect timing. Hold fast to him, and you will find that no season is wasted, and no soul is forgotten. And dear listener, if this tale lifted your spirit, then do a kindness in return. Like this story, subscribe for more, and share it with others, so they too may know that God's timing is never late, and his love never fails.